2005, when I got sober, I basically I needed to still have a high. I've never been comfortable living in reality and or living in a body, and so I began practicing meditation to to connect to something like bigger than me. And that was, yeah, and that's how I got started. So for years, I did like the Melissa Broder method of meditation, which was basically just like a cobbled together different methods of like guided meditations from YouTube and things that I had read. And I was on this gratitude list with 3 friends, and they were all doing transcendental meditation. And I was like, fuck these bitches, like with their paid meditation and paying for your spiritual education. And then I was like, because in order to learn TM, you pay a certain amount, right? You pay like a percentage of your, they do it on a sliding scale, but there's a fee for the first time and then no more fees. So, but I tried it. I decided to try it because I guess like 5 years ago, I felt like, well, I pay a lot of money for my hair color. Why not invest in my spiritual education? And I really liked TM. It really moved the needle with my anxiety. And I practiced that for about 5 years. And then about a year ago, I had like a mild to moderate, like nervous breakdown-ish. And I needed a new modality. And so I needed something that I could connect to 24 hours a day. And with TM, there's this mantra. You have a mantra, but you don't say the mantra to yourself when you're not in meditation. You only say the mantra when you are in the meditation. But so I needed to connect to something that I could connect to all the time. So I started practicing shamatha and vipassana style meditation where you connect to the breath, because I felt like I needed a home inside myself. I needed an anchor, and the breath became that anchor. And it was something that I could tether to even when I wasn't in meditation.
Okay, so let's go backwards a little bit, because I just want to know like what it was that introduced you, or who it was that introduced you to meditation, period, in the beginning. Like, was it something you read about? Was there a person in your life who was like, hey, you should try this? Like, what was it?
I think it's just the path of my sobriety that I'm on. A lot of my sober friends were meditating, and I found that I really needed to build in pause. And, I have not become enlightened. So I guess I've been meditating for, I guess it's been like, I've been sober 18 years, but I think I started meditating like a year later. So I've been meditating for like 17 years, and I haven't become enlightened. In fact, like I feel like I'm someone who really needs meditation, where there are some people who are just sort of like temperamentally, they probably don't ever need to meditate, like their life is like my friend Frank, who he's like this very jolly man, lives in Queens, he's always somehow, like when New York One is doing like a special on a bakery, Frank is always in the bakery, like Frank somehow is always in the bakery. He always happens to be behind the counter, like getting donuts. And like Frank, I don't think Frank ever needs to meditate, because like Frank is meditation. I am like the opposite of meditation. So I really need it.
As do I.
Yeah, I mean, but Brad, I see you as, it's funny because I see you as someone who is very grounded. But how long have you been practicing?
I have been meditating since I was like 21 years old, 2021 in Boulder.
So Boulder,
And
I mean, I don't even have to ask how you got into it. Boulder.
exactly. I mean, it was like, I mean, I don't know what it's like now, because the town has gotten a lot bougier, and it's like it's like a tech hub now. But when I was there, it wasn't. And it was definitely a very Buddhist town. And there was a lot of Naropa University influence and Chogyam Trungpa, influence, which I didn't know what either of those things even was when I got there. But you walk around Pearl Street in Boulder, and there were like 3 Tibetan gift shops, like separate ones, all thriving, like, and so it was around. And then I took like a religious studies course, like as an elective. And then I had a bad back in college even, and I started doing yoga. And I think like the beginning of any kind of mindfulness meditation practice for me was mostly, but not all, centered on movement meditation, just because I was young and jumpy and I liked the exercise part of it, but it also delivered. Like a good yoga class could settle me down. I noticed it. So that was like point of entry. And then like dedicated sitting started later, in my like late 20s and then onward.
Did you
So
meditate this morning?
yeah,
I didn't.
yeah. You didn't. Yeah, I mean, I try to do it every day. I'm mostly successful, but sometimes life gets in the way, or especially like the evening meditation. If you're trying to do two a day, I know that with TM, that's sort of the program. I have always found that the evening sit is harder to bat a high average on, just because you get caught up in your stuff.
Well, you have children too. I do like twice a day, but then I allow myself 2 of the days a week to skip one of them so that there's not a perfectionist element. But I try to do twice a day. But this morning I was like Google like online shopping got me before the meditation got me, and that's the end. That's the
That's the
death
end.
knell, you know?
I hear that. And I mean, sometimes I do online shopping. I got to say, I'm not immune to that. Like, especially now that, because I have the podcast on Instagram, fucking Instagram feeding me clothing advertisements. And these people look fabulous. And I'm like, that sweater looks cool. They get you. And then they know that you even, not that you even clicked through or ordered it. They know if you like linger on it. So they start feeding you more of that stuff. And that can suck you in.
Yeah, I woke up this morning in a cold well in like a hot sweat. It was like a tepid sweat, and was like, "Fuck, I didn't get anything from my publishers or my agent. Like I didn't get them any presents for Christmas." So then I was like, "Must find the perfect candles." And I was like, but you know what I have to say, I went through this odyssey the past year or two of like changing psych meds, and it's been like pretty rough, and I'm finally on like a good cocktail. But there was like a period for like the past year and a half where like online shopping didn't work. You know what I'm saying? Like I was just like, why? Like it was very like, why do we go on was like eclipsing any desire to online shop. And so I actually feel as though I'm very relieved to be like taking refuge once again in superficial bullshit. Like it feels like it's like that feels like mental health to me right now, you
Feels
know?
it's like typical. And I mean, look, it's also seasonally appropriate right now, right?
Totally.
But I'm interested to know. I mean, you mentioned earlier that you had like an almost nervous breakdown, or this difficult period where you had to like change psych meds, and that can be difficult for somebody because getting the cocktail right, I know can be challenging. And when things are not in effect, if you have a difficult neurochemistry, then life can be harder than it otherwise would be. And so, a question for you, because you're so productive, and I think to the casual person, it's like, no, Melissa's got her shit together. She keeps churning out these great books and has her stuff together. But you're also dealing with life stuff that is very challenging. And, like you're sober, and that's been in effect for a long time. But maintaining that takes a lot of concerted effort and disciplined practice in its own right. I'm curious to know if during this period of transition with psych meds and this kind of turbulence that you experienced in terms of your mental health, if you were meditating through that.
I absolutely was. So basically, what happened was, I'll give you like the 2 minute version, and then I'll tell you how meditation came into play. So after my dad was in his accident, he was in the ICU for 6 months, and then
Oh, your dad had a car accident.
my dad had a car accident in December of 2020, and then he was in the ICU for 6 months during COVID. I was here, he was in Philadelphia, and I couldn't see him for the first few months. And this is actually like the inspiration for my novel that came out recently, Death Valley. And so I, but then I was, and I was like very much the rock of the family during that whole time. And then after he died, within about 2 weeks, I was like, I didn't know how to sit with the grief now that he was gone. And I was scared. I was afraid that like my usual levels of anxiety and depression were like spawning new babies. Like it was just that it was like mutating. And I was just like, how long is this going to go on? You know, I didn't know how to just be with it. And so I became like obsessed with my own mental health. And about a year later, I found out that someone who had been very close to me died of suicide. And then about 6 months later, we lost another friend to suicide. And I think like the confluence of those events, um, I became obsessed with, am I suicidal? It was like and I ended up about 5 months ago doing an intensive outpatient treatment for anxiety and depression, and then doing another intensive outpatient treatment for OCD. And I had to cancel my book tour. I didn't go on the book tour for Death Valley because of what I was dealing with. So, and was changing meds throughout all this time, which is really harrowing. And so throughout all of it, this is why I switched to the Vipassana, because I really needed an anchor. I needed something that could be with me 24 hours a day, right? Like the mantra that I have with TM, I don't get to have that throughout the day. It's like it's recommended that you don't sit around saying this mantra over and over again. Also, as someone with prior undiagnosed OCD, you can turn anything into a compulsion. Like you can turn the best things into a compulsion. And this past year, I've been working on a journal project where I was like trying to solve my mood, trying to figure it out. And I'm not going to publish this journal, but I've decided not to, because I had to stop doing it because it became so myopic and so hyper obsessive. But part of the journal project, it was this trying to find a home within myself. And I was getting into Alan Watts and all these wonderful things, these things that in and of themselves, Zen breath counting is great. Uh, you, different Vipassana is amazing. TM is amazing. There are like so many wonderful modalities, and I'm of the belief that truth is one, paths are many. But basically, I was looking for a solution to being a human being and a solution to feeling and to grief. And there's no solution to being a human being, right? Like even meditation in and of itself, monks practice for years to not be scared of death, and the flip side of that is the fear of life, right? So this idea that there's going to be some arrival, I think is antithetical to the idea of meditation as a practice, right? It's all
Right.
a practice. It's all a practice.
And the way through is through. Like, the way to like transcend fear of death is to really confront your fear of death and to investigate it and all that kind of stuff. So it's not like there's not like a workaround to any difficult human stuff, in my understanding. It's like that's part of what meditating teaches you, is that there's my shit, there's my crazy brain. Like it's not going anywhere. You sort of have to look at it and do the work. There's no shortcuts.
No, and I think that the only way through is through idea is very interesting in the sense of there's a you, with the only way through is through. I kept being like, okay, so am I through yet? And I'm like, when will this end? Right? There's this desire for this ending. And Joseph Goldstein, who I really like, another Jew boo.
And he's like, we should say, because I am going to make us pause in a second and kind of go through some terms, and define some things for people who are listening who might not be as immersed in all of this stuff or might be totally new to it. But Joseph Goldstein is one of the OG Western purveyors of like Buddhist psychology teaching, meditation practice. He helped found the Insight Meditation Society, which has one of the more noted and long-standing meditation centers out in Barre, Massachusetts. Then there's Spirit Rock on the West Coast in the Bay Area. But he and like Jack Kornfield and Sharon Salzberg, all Jews, all Jew-boos, right? Like they were in like the trajectory of the integration of Eastern Buddhist practice and psychology with the West in a general sense in the mid to late 20th century and now into the 21st century, tracked with basically some baby boomers, many of whom had had psychedelic experiences or not, many of whom were in the Peace Corps. Like that was a trajectory that a lot of them followed. They were in the Peace Corps. They were assigned or chose to somehow be in Southeast Asia. And they were then in close contact with Buddhist culture and practitioners and teachers. Like, right. So that's how Joseph got into it. That's how Jack got into it. That's how Sharon got into it. And they like, was Joseph a monk? I don't know if he ordained, but like some of these people actually ordained and were in robes for a period and then
Joseph was in the Peace Corps, I believe. Sharon was studying at an ashram.
And then Jack was, I know Jack Cornfield was in robes. He ordained and was studying under Ajahn Chah. So then they leave South after, a certain amount of years, a number of years there. They then came back to the States, I think in the 70s,
Yep.
and then just started like, what do we do now? And they kind of started this stuff from scratch and eventually raised money and built IMS out in Barre, Massachusetts, and started teaching and they were the vanguard. And now, of course, like there's a yoga studio on every corner, and meditation is like it's practiced everywhere. So it's really a great success story in terms of what they were able to do.
Yeah, Sharon Salzberg's mommy. She's mommy. Like I'm just like, I'm like, please, just like, like take me to your breast. But but Joseph Goldstein. So that was a great explanation, Brad. That was like a great history of, and then it was Vipassana. That was the style they brought here.
And Vipassana meditation is what? Insight meditation?
Yes,
Is
insight
Vipassana means
meditation.
insight.
Yes, it's
And what
insight
is that?
meditation.
What does that even mean? And I ask this like not even sure if I fully know.
So, well, shamatha meditation is sort of is like the first tier, and that's focusing on the breath. It's really just staying with the breath. Vipassana is sort of like the next step, if you will, and you start with the breath, and then you start to tune into different other parts of your body, and then you start to label your thoughts. So it's sort of it's mindfulness, really. It's mindfulness, and but it starts with the breath. And I try to stay with the breath. I'm like, I can't get too into the labeling. That's also why like Buddhism, I'm not a Buddhist because there's so many lists. I get like obsessed with the lists, and then like I'm with my head, not with the heart. But Joseph Goldstein had this beautiful, he has a really great podcast, and there was one, it was about sitting with pain and sitting with emotional pain. And he was talking about when you sit with emotional pain, but like, and you're doing it with the intent that like, okay, if I can just sit with this enough, right? Like if I can just go through, I will come out the other side. Like that's sort of waiting for it to pass. And he's like, no, that's not what it is. It's you're sitting for the sitting. And I'm a big waiting for it to pass, or not waiting. I'm a big like, let me fix this, right? And I think meditation is the opposite, but of fixing, right? It's being, and being is hard.
It is. I think like everything's impermanent, right? Everything. So we're all going to die. Every tree, eventually the mountains are going to crumble into the sea, right? Like nothing is permanent in the in our universe that we can observe.
That was very
And
Motown of you.
it was like quoting a song.
I don't know. The mountains crumble to the sea. Yeah.
Yeah, that is a line. Okay, so I get that, right? That seems observably true. That's easy enough for me to grasp. But things like deep grief over the loss of a loved one or something along those lines, that isn't, I mean, I think that maybe the intensity can lessen or fluctuate, but there are certain things in human experience that feel pretty fixed. Like the loss of a parent, the grief that you feel over that, that's never going to fully go away. And so meditation practice is looking at it, seeing it for what it is, noticing its fluctuations, and then hopefully getting to some kind of place of acceptance and helping you strengthen yourself so that you're able to carry it better. It's the kind of thing you carry with you at all for the rest of your life, right?
Yeah, I mean, I think like it's a really big lesson for me, this desire to be done. Also the forevers and the nevers. Like any state that I'm in, I always believe it's going to be like this forever. When it's a state of peace, I want peace like all the time, right? Especially, I think that's a very addict thing is to want immunity to pain. I mean, I no human being enjoys pain. Some people enjoy pain, actually. I think there are some people, but and sexually, especially, there's a whole community. But in terms of, but I think that like addicts are particularly sensitive, and so there's a fear of pain. Like I still feel like it's like 911. I felt a feeling, that sort of a thing. And it's a lesson for me because well, first of all, with my husband's disability, which I wrote, which is, I mean, Death Valley is fiction. My newer novel is fiction, but the protagonist has a disabled husband. And, one thing with like a long-term disability, I mean, he's been disabled as, as long as we've been together, but it's progressive. And so it's been about 20 years. And 3 months after my dad died, my husband's illness shifted again, and he now needs a wheelchair in order to walk a couple of blocks. So it's like there was another shift, and that was really hard to grapple with. But when he's a little better, I'm always like, okay, it's going to be like this forever. And then when he's in bed, right, for a couple months, I'm like, it's going to be like this forever. And the same is true of feelings for me. When I feel terror or sadness, usually the terror follows the sadness, but when I feel anxiety or grief, even if it's just for a couple of hours, even if it's just for a few moments, I'm like, oh no, am I going to be trapped here? And it's this, so I think the only way out is through, but it's like, in my experience, there's no permanent out. And the more I want there to be a permanent out, the more like I'm in the in the cream of the whoopie pie, so to speak.
The more you suffer, right? The more you want something that you can't have, then that's human suffering, right?
I mean, one of my favorite Buddhist parables is the second arrow, which is, right, the second arrow is the best. I mean, it's not the best, it's the worst, but it's the best parable, right? So it's like there's two arrows. The first arrow we get hit with is the arrow of experience, or the arrow of a feeling, like a challenging feeling like grief or a long-term disability or whatever it is, right? It's either circumstance, feeling. The second arrow is what we do to ourselves. And it's when we're already injured, and then we hurl that second arrow at ourselves. And it's like, what's wrong with me? Or why am I not through this? Or when will I be okay? Or am I enough? Or will I ever write again? Right? All that stuff.
So yeah, you'd like ruminate on it and fixate on it and resist whatever is. And all of that self-generative or self-generated thought work essentially is the second arrow, makes it that much worse.
Yes.
So try not to fire the second one. And I don't know, that's hard. It's hard. I mean, that's like, I feel like I'm second arrowing all the time.
Brad, Listi.
Maybe even three, like you can really pile on yourself. And it's easy to be hard on yourself too, for like, you're like sad because you've lost a loved one, or you're more tired and less productive than you normally are. And you could just I can be so hard on myself, even in those kinds of times. And it's like, you got to be gentle with yourself sometimes,
Yeah. Which is like, well, life is in session. And so it's like, oh my God, what will happen if I don't fire the second arrow? And I wonder too, I was thinking about the third arrow, because there's like 80 arrows. It's a whole, I don't know what the Robin Hood, like the case
quiver.
of it, the quiver. It's like, we're just walking quivers, right?
Yeah. No doubt about it. So before we get any further, just for people listening who might be totally new to this subject matter, you've talked a bit about modalities. You talked about TM, which is transcendental meditation, which is the Maharishi Mahesh Yogi, who was the Beatles guru, and who, late 20th, like mid to late 20th century, and I think even into the early 21st, built TM into like a big thing. It's also very popular, I should say, among celebrities. David Lynch is a huge proponent, Jerry Seinfeld, Howard Stern. I mean, famously, there are a lot of celebs who do TM. And you have what you have said more than once is a mantra in TM. What is a mantra, so people who don't know what a mantra is can understand it better?
Sure. So a mantra is it can be English, it can be in English, but in TM, it's a Indian. It's a seed. It's actually a seed so it's a sound seed. And what a seed is it's like a part. Actually, whatever. I'm probably going to get canceled for this because I shouldn't be the one to explain like what a seed is. I mean, it's all in the West now, but like it's like Melissa Broder tries to explain what a Hindu seed word is. But a mantra is a word that you repeat over and over. And in TM, these seeds are they're said to be imbued with different powers. And like, but for example, so there's also like mantra, like in yoga, for example, you can do like a Ganesh mantra, and Ganesh is the remover of obstacles, right? Or you could do the Kali mantra, and she's like fierce. Kali is a goddess who's like a fierce goddess. Ganesha is like said to be lucky, a god of luck and happiness. Or you can do you could, like, I know that Mahatma Gandhi used Ram, 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 Ram for Rama. And then that's said to be connected to the solar plexus chakra, which is strength. So there's, I'm not going to get too into the Hindu dynamics of it or the Indian dynamics of it, but essentially a mantra is something that you repeat over and over to fortify oneself.
Yeah, and it's like to a lay person or somebody who's new to this, like it's almost like it's almost like a nonsense word, or I guess a word that you don't really have like a translation for any even, that you might be focusing on or syncing up with your inhales and your exhales, and it gives you something to focus on. It's really that simple, right? And then it might also be a word that is imbued with certain meaning, and by repeating it, it sort of keeps you in a good headspace. It's like a reminder almost. And I find mantra meditation useful just as something to focus on. And I think for people who are newer, this idea that you you repeat a mantra, usually silently if you're doing it in meditation, or sometimes people chant them, but usually it's like a silent thing that you're just repeating to yourself in synchronicity with inhale and exhale. Or you are sitting and you are just following your inhales and your exhales. And you might even label like inhale, exhale. And there's nothing particularly magical about either. It's really just about getting you to learn how to concentrate the mind. Because one of the things that I hear over and over again whenever I'm talking to people about meditation, or they're asking me about it at like a Thanksgiving dinner table or whatever, you'll hear people say like, I can't do it. Like, I can't turn my mind off. It just keeps going. Have you ever heard this?
Yes.
And what do you say to people? Because I think this is a misconception of meditation that needs to be clarified. It's not about, ultimately, yes, you do quiet the mind. But if you are seeing your thoughts and you are seeing the craziness of your mind, and it feels like there's not an off switch, you're not doing it wrong.
I'm usually meditating on food. Like, I'm usually thinking about like when the ice cream is that I'm going to be eating. If you want to know the truth.
Yeah.
So, but yeah, no, I don't think the point, sometimes we do get that delicious transcendent peace, but it's like, that's not necessarily, I wish it was all the time, but that's not like the point, right? Like, I don't know that I can say what the point is, but to observe one's thoughts, like there's not going to be no thoughts, there's just not all the time. Sometimes, well, in TM they talk about like the ocean, and that the waves might, the surface of the ocean might be choppy, but underneath there's that quiet sea, there's that quiet darkness, right? So both can exist, right? And so I think there is this conception that like if you're having thoughts, you're doing it wrong, and it's like no, not at all.
It's like, yeah, you become like, I think one of the things that I find really interesting about it is to bear witness to that. Like, because before I started doing meditation, I had no idea. It was totally just running me. And then if you're sitting down consistently and bearing witness to the insanity, like my mind is all over the place, and like in 10 different directions too. It's not like there's any even like logic to what I'm thinking. Like sometimes I'll start off and I'll be in like some sort of imagined argument with a friend of mine, and then I'll shift and I'll be like self-critical, and then I'll shift and I'll be planning my day or imagining lunch or whatever it is, and you get all of that in 20 minutes and you're like,
you get
like,
all of that in 30 seconds.
it's like an opera, and
yes.
And so you
The Greek
realize, like,
chorus of
that's it.
hell.
It is. And it's like, oh my God, this is like what's going on in my head all the time. And only now am I even aware of it because I'm sitting here like still and I don't have my phone in front of me, or, I'm not doing anything except sitting. And that alone is useful. And I have come to the point where I find it interesting. Like, it can be a little annoying too, but I do find it interesting just to see the mind do its thing. It's out of control.
It's out of control. And at the same time, totally natural, right? And I think that's what, like, I would say to someone who says they can't, I can't meditate, I can't stop thinking. It's like, yeah, that's totally natural, right? Because, like, it's referred to as monkey mind, but I think, like, to pathologize it or to say like this is wrong or bad, but yeah, some of us have minds that move very, very fast, right? And it's and it's like, are we really going to be able to like fully dismantle the ego? No. But I think what you said about approaching from a place of curiosity rather than believing the hype entirely, to even have those just pockets of time where we can watch it, right? As opposed to being in the movie, right? It's like you're watching the movie instead of being in the deranged movie. The chaotic, deranged movie is that's, I think, like a good starting place.
Yeah, I mean, like the mind, like this idea of, or this notion of, I'm doing it wrong because I can't stop my mind from generating thoughts. Like, a good comparison for me that has always stayed with me is that, like, that's what the mind does. It generates thoughts in the way that the salivary glands generate saliva. So just think of it that way. Like, yeah, you don't sit around castigating your salivary glands for generating saliva. That's just what they do. That is what mind does. It generates thoughts. And the beauty of meditating and like following the breath or doing the mantra, whatever it is that it does settle down over time. And that should be said too, because it's not just sitting in the movie theater watching the deranged movie. If you sit consistently and for me in particular, I think if I sit for longer periods of time, sometimes I'll have a better chance of settling down, just because I need more time, to just get my brain to just chill. But I will have certain sessions where there is a quieting and the movie does like slow down. Sometimes the movie stops entirely.
The
Is that
best.
the best? But it doesn't happen every time.
The dark theater.
The dark theater. That does happen for you.
Oh, gorgeous. Yes, I live for that. I mean, that's why I was always fucked up for the first 25 years of my life, because like I love the dark theater. Oh, I love the dark theater.
Yeah. And you used to get that
no
from like
previews, no preview, no horrific previews. All horrific previews, right? Like It's always horrific because it's all about the future. So it's like these terrifying previews of just like the doom that is to come. But the dark theater, man, I just give me some pretzels and M&Ms and popcorn and M&Ms, mix them up, and let me just sit in that dark theater with my eyes closed. Baruch Hashem, baby. Yes,
so
the dark theater.
But that's what keeps you coming back. And I mean, you do get a taste, and the idea is that you get more proficient at being able to generate that state, but you also don't want to attach to that state. That's kind of the trick.
Well, that's the thing. And that's what addiction is, right? I mean, we can easily bring that into meditation, because it's like, and it's like, how do you integrate it all, right? Like, and it's like, sometimes there's going to be like really hellacious previews. And sometimes it's not even that you're watching the movie. Sometimes like the theater is filled with like, you're in, those like, when you go see a play and like they go into the audience like Cats.
Yeah.
Like the play, I remember being, as a kid, I went to see Cats, and like the cats are like jellicle cats, and they're like all in the audience and shit. And like, am I allowed? Yeah, I can curse on this, right?
Of course,
and I can drink from, by the way, I hope no one watches this on YouTube, because I'm super self-conscious of my middle-aged woman ombre mug. It's horrific. But that's what my mind has been saying for the past 10 minutes. Like, should I drink from like the cheesy mug? Literally, that's what I've been thinking about for the past 10 minutes. but yeah, so I feel like sometimes it's not even just like it's a horror movie. It's like they're in there, you know, like you're being called up on stage by the comedian. Like you're being heckled by the comic, and you're in the audience and you're like, oh, I shouldn't have sat in the front row. Like that's how real the mind is.
Well, and it's like this idea of happiness being an event kind of obstacle too. Like one of the things that like makes a lot of sense to me and like help clarify some things for me is the fact that happiness is a form of suffering too.
Mm-hmm.
Like it's not just like, oh, I lost a parent and I'm grieving, and it's this very clear like sadness, which we would label as like a negative feeling and life experience, right? But then something goes well, and it's like, oh my God, like my book is a bestseller, or something great happened in my career, and it's like this source of immense elation and this positive feeling. That elation and positive feeling is actually a form of suffering, because of course when that sort of stuff happens, you cling to it and you're like, I don't want it to go away. I like this. I want to keep this here. And of course you can't keep it there because everything is impermanent. And so you suffer over its dissipation, or that book sinking back down off the bestseller list, or whatever it is, So I think there's some sort of equanimity to be found in a middle ground where you're not clinging to suffering or happiness. And like, you know, that's what I'm working towards. I'm not there yet.
I was doing this thing this year or the past couple of years, where I was so hyper focused on like, am I okay? Am I okay? Am I getting better? Is the depression ceasing? Is the grief ceasing? That when I sold Death Valley, um, okay, the day I sold Death Valley, I started horseback riding again, which was something I like adored as a child. And the day I sold Death Valley was like my second horseback riding lesson. And I I found out the book had sold like to Scribner, which was the publisher who did Milk Fed, that, and I love them so much. So I was like very happy to be working with them again. My agent had gone back to them to try to get their first offer. She was like, we need to get it's worth more than this. And then so she went back, and it was within like an hour that we found out that they agreed, which never happens. Usually it's like days and days. So it was like it was like great, right? Like it was like, and also I was really happy because my dad like knew Scribner and like loved a lot of the authors back in the day who had published. So it was just good. And then I go and I'm horseback riding, and I'm like, okay, my childhood dreams are like coming through. Always wanted to be a writer, always wanted to, okay, I've sold like not just a book, but like my third novel, right? To like a publisher I love, and I'm on a horse. And I was like, oh no, why am I filled with doom? You should be happier. And I was like, what's wrong with you that you're not happier? If you can't be happy now, like you, and that's when, and it was like, you should just kill yourself. Like if you can't be happy on the back of a horse, having just sold, like living your childhood dream, that's the insanity, right? These expectations. But yes, I also, there is, but there is also when you are actually happy, and you are actually sort of riding high on something that isn't just, you know, existing, right, or being, right, because that bliss of existence, that just existence sans achievements, without all the ego trappings. Like there is also that too, where it's like, yes, this is good, like yes, like gimme, like the ego is just like gimme, and then what goes up must come down, always.
Well, and I think like it's worth clarifying too that like it's not that you don't. We're not advocating that you don't enjoy nice moments.
Right.
It's great. It's totally fine to be happy when like you get a book deal or something goes well in your life, or
Yeah,
like
it's good to be happy. When you're not, then you're like, oh no. Or
the
I am.
issue is like grabbing onto or identifying with
Yeah.
either. Like, oh, something goes bad, I suck, I'm a failure, I should die. Something goes right, like this is who I am, I've achieved something, people love me. Like, because then when it goes away, all of the opposite becomes true, or it becomes this kind of sadness, or you fall into this state of dissatisfaction. So that I think gives us kind of an overview of like your history with meditation, how you came to it, some of the terms, though not all of the terms, and modalities that people can sort of explore on their own if they're interested. But I definitely want to start to zero in on the use of meditation for you when it comes to your creative work, because you are super generative
Yeah.
and prolific by, I think, like most people's standards. Like, you put out a book every 2 years, you're sort of on that cycle, it seems like. And that's not easy to do. And you have to be really focused and hardworking, obviously. But I know from knowing you a bit that meditation is definitely a part of the system you use to sort of nurture and like nurture your creativity and to help feed the work. So can you just talk about how you do it, how you use meditation for those purposes?
Absolutely. So I think for drafting and for sort of for the ideas process, uh, there's definitely, I mean, that's a more, I think, it's seemingly straightforward, that ideas will come to me in meditation, right? Or um, that I can. David Lynch in Catching the Big Fish talks about, that's his book on meditation. Talks about how there are a lot of fish in the ocean, right? But you want to catch the big fish, like you want to catch like the juicy idea. And so meditation allows us to sort of um, see the big fish, right? To see, because things can become stiller. I'm about to mix like 80 metaphors, but but like if the pond is stiller, is more still, you can see everything much more clearly, and so you see, okay, this is the fish, right? And so so in that sense, in the drafting sense, I think it's more of an understandable connection. How, okay, meditation, you become still, there's not as much distraction towards the end of the meditation, perhaps not always, not even
Right.
half the time, but sometimes, right? And then we can sort of feel really like which we can fall in, I can fall in love. I can fall in love, and on an archetypal level, like archetypes will often come to me during meditation. So um, for example, the Pisces, I was on a beach when I wrote my novel, The Pisces, which is about a woman who falls in love with a merman. I was on the beach in Venice Beach, where I was living, and I was reading this book, The Professor and the Siren, by Giuseppe Tomasi de Lampedusa, dead Italian guy. And the it's a book about a man recounting his love affair with a mermaid. And I was like, and then I meditated. I hadn't meditated that morning, and I meditated on the beach, and I was like, why is it always an older man and a younger mermaid? Why isn't it ever like an older woman and a young merman, a young hot merman? And so it was like I was able to sort of a bunch of, like, there's an alchemy that occurred that maybe I wouldn't have had room for all of those things to alchemize, right? Like just happening to be like, there was a situational component. I was on a beach that there's mountains. It looks a bit like Crete, right? So there's that Grecian element to it. I've just read this book about a man and a mermaid, and then I'm meditating, and like, oh, and the other piece was, my husband and I had just become monogamous again after having an open marriage, and I had this question of, why is it that a healthy long-term relationship doesn't feel as good as a like a hot like a completely unavailable relationship that like will kill you. And like I feel like 15-year-olds know the answer to that, but like I was like really troubled by this like I was really troubled that the healthy relationship where you're like, yo, can you like get me Ambisol at CVS, like why that can't be the same as a sort of as a distance. So there was like a lot of components at play. And then I think because I was meditating on the beach, there was like a synthesis that happened where all of these things, and instead of trying to figure it out or fix or solve, it sort of came to me slant through this archetype. Because if you think about what's the ultimate unavailable relationship, it's a human and a mer person. There's no greater unavailability than a human, than somebody who has to live in the water and somebody who has to live on land. I mean, that's like that your therapist is just like, I don't think it's going to work, you know? So that's how meditation sort of worked to synthesize that. But what I think is actually even more interesting than sort of like the generative component of meditation for me is the way I've used meditation in the editing process. So I'll give you like two anecdotes.
Yeah, but before we get there, I just want to
Yeah.
underscore. I want to underscore something.
Yeah.
Uh, David Lynch's book, Catching the Big Fish. I've read it. It's an outstanding audiobook because he does the vocals and like
Oh,
listening to him.
cool.
Yeah, he does it in his voice. You know, he's got that like great voice and he reads the audiobook. And that's, I think, how I think I read it and I listened to it. I loved listening to it. And the reason I want to underscore it is A, because of that, but B, because it is a particularly useful text for creative people interested in exploring this relationship between meditation and creativity and how one can potentially benefit the other. Like that's sort of his thing, right? I mean, that's really what he's about, at least in primary, and it's useful in that way and fun to listen to. So I want to say that, and then I want to ask a kind of follow up question to this idea of synthesis because as it pertains to catching the big fish, if we're going to continue this metaphor, like that is the big fish, is the synthesis, right? I mean, that's kind of what you would not have noticed if you were swimming in waters that weren't quite as still, that were muddier. You wouldn't have seen that process happen. You wouldn't have noticed it. So much about meditating is noticing, and so much about being a creative person is noticing maybe your best thoughts or noticing these syntheses when they happen or noticing things out in the world that might serve as fodder or inspiration. Like writers in general tend to be good noticers, but does that square with what you think?
Definitely. I mean, figure it out is not the solution, right? Like whether it's a problem in our life or whether it's like I think that there's something that happens when we meditate that like, you know, the answer is within, Brad, right? Like it's like, but it is. It's just not, in my experience, it's often in like a symbolic or a slant way, right? It's like we can't solve the problem from the same like level of consciousness that like created it, so to speak. And I think the same is very true in writing as well, right? And how do we dismantle the ego enough to get out of at least, or how do we kind of transcend, right? How do we transcend it? Because I think it's in we have an idea of what the story is. We have an idea of what the story, and then there's what the story actually is, right? And I think that's true. Like we have a problem, we think we have a problem, and then there's like actually the problem is like our problem with the problem, the second arrow, right? Like that's and so the constant like fixing and figuring it out. I'm going to figure it out, both in like I think editing or writing and in life, like that's not the meditation gives us kind of another way in.
Well, yeah, and it's like what you're saying is something that I've run up against as a writer more than once, and I think it's fairly common, is that you do have some sort of philosophical or spiritual or emotional or psychological issue or situational issue even that's gnawing at you. And one of the things, like one of the traps I feel like I've fallen into is that my job as a writer, in particular, I think as a writer of fiction, is to somehow solve it and present the solution when in fact it's maybe more accurate to say that the job is to articulate the question well than it is to, because some of these things there isn't like a neat and tidy answer with a bow. There might be solutions to particular creative problems in the text, right? You do have to make choices as a writer in terms of how you assemble the story and how you develop the characters and all that stuff. And so I think there maybe are more concrete, quote unquote, answers to those kinds of issues. But it's the deeper stuff of the story, like this question you talked about, like why does like a relationship that's like toxic and difficult and will ultimately kill you, why does that feel better than running to the drugstore to get your husband's medication or like cold medicine or something? It's like that is an interesting question. And there's maybe not one answer to it, or if there even is like a tidy answer to it. And just by presenting that, I think for people and then guiding them through you're guiding them through a narrative, you do reach some kind of resolution, but it's rarely like tied up in a bow, right?
Well, it's yeah, and I mean thinking about like when I think about your book, I mean your most recent book, Be Brief and I mean I read the draft, it wasn't the first draft, but I read like the early draft of that. Remember? And then the way it changed. And like, I feel like the problem changed a lot, right? Like the problem of the first book was miscarriage. And the early draft was miscarriage. Um, and then the problem of, and then that was no longer really the whole problem, in in the published version. I mean, it's actually interesting. There's always a new suffering.
I was going to say, it's like, just give it time. Something else
Just
will
give it time. What you think you want will come with its own challenges. Um, yeah, I was just thinking about your book, and just in the way that it changed time. But that's sort of, I think, in a way, right? Like we can't figure it out. We can't figure it
You
out.
might have little moments of insight and levity, but it's like these deeper griefs, like that we were talking about earlier. It's not about absolving yourself of them, getting rid of them, transcending them, getting past them, as much as it is learning how to carry them with grace and accepting them as part of human, like not just your personal reality, but I think human reality. Like, who doesn't grieve? You live here long enough, you're going to grieve, right? That's baked into the cake.
It is baked into the cake. It's annoying though. The cake is annoying. It's like not my favorite flavor. Like, I was just having I was having fantasies about cake the other night. Like I was just laying in bed and I was like, oh God, I'm old, because like I'm not fantasizing about people anymore. I'm fantasizing about cakes. I was ranking like my favorite cakes. And I'm like, I really like carrot cake actually, with cream cheese frosting.
Yeah, I mean, everybody's got their favorite. I gotta say, I like some sort of berry crumble or pie. I love that.
Get out of here.
I'm a pie guy. I like a good pie.
You're one of those people who prefers fruit to chocolate, right?
I mean, I don't know. I like it all. I'll eat a piece of chocolate cake too. But if you put me in, put both in front of me, I would probably take like the blueberry pie.
You'll take the berry crumble. I'm sorry. That was very judgmental of me.
No, listen.
And also, I brought up carrot cake. That's like, what kind of bullshit is that? Someone who loves carrot cake is in no position to be judging berry pie.
I think whatever makes you happy. But I know there are people who have strong feelings about hot fruit. Like if you're warming up fruit, it's like a violation, of something.
I feel like hot fruit is like a late 60s, like Haight-Ashbury band.
Hot tuna, I think is what you're thinking of.
And like Strawberry Alarm Clock.
So
that's their super group.
Hot Alarm Clock, I think is what it's
Hot
called.
Strawberry.
So anyway, I want to kind of drill down. You talked about this experience that you had on the beach. I actually remember talking to you in close to like the immediate aftermath of that. And you were trying to like explain to me. It's like one of those things that's really hard to, I think, convince somebody else of how intense it was for you. You're like, I was on the beach, I meditated, I saw a mermaid, and I was like, okay, like, but then lo and behold, it leads to an entire novel. Like it really was like a big moment for you creatively.
Well, that always happens. Like when I was like, I'll try to explain, like when I was driving, so when my dad was in the ICU, I was driving back and forth to Vegas to see my sister. My sister lives in Vegas, and I was driving through Baker, California, which is like, it's the home of the world. Oh, Pickle's on the video.
Hi, Pickle.
Which is the home of the world's largest thermometer. And like this idea came to me of this giant cactus where you could go inside and encounter your loved ones at different stages of their life. I told some friends, like I think I told my friend Kate Durbin, I told a couple of artists, I was like, yeah, and like it's a giant cactus, and like, you go inside and they're like, okay, like they don't, but actually that book, it was interesting because Death Valley. So I was like, okay, this woman's just going to keep going back and forth from this Best Western in the desert, back and forth to this giant cactus, and like encountering her father and her husband as at different stages of their lives when they're young. But then I did another desert recon trip. So I went out and I ended up in Death Valley. I wasn't planning to be in Death Valley. And I decided, in the morning, I decided to go to this area called Zabriskie Point, where it's like a very touristy area. Nobody gets lost. Like nobody gets lost there. It's like extremely touristy. I got so fucking lost. And I didn't have any water with me, only Coke Zero.
Were you on foot?
I was on foot because, and here's the thing, Brad, I wasn't paying attention. I was on my phone. So I was on my phone. I wasn't being mindful. I was not observing anything about where I was. I was taking notes as I was walking, like of the different shrubbery and stuff for my desert book that I was writing. I got so lost. I was like, my phone was dead, or the reception was gone, and I lost service. I'm like crying, like, how long have I been out here? It had been like, 30 minutes. I got really cut up. Like I got really messed up trying to get back. I had climbed up this rock face, and got all scraped up. I got back to my car, and like by the time, and I stopped crying. And when I stopped crying, I was like, oh, now I know what needs to happen in this novel. My protagonist is going to get lost in the desert. So sometimes actually not being mindful and non-meditative and not paying attention actually can help us write. But again, I think it's like this being open to the alchemy, right? And then I had to decide is this going to be a desert survival story? I was not planning that, and
okay.
yeah.
Okay. So I have questions.
Yeah.
Like when it comes to things like the merman in the Pisces, or this giant
cactus.
the giant cactus inspired by the thermometer in Baker, California,
Yeah.
which anybody who's ever driven from LA to Vegas knows that thermometer, right? You see it from the freeway, and
yeah,
it advertises itself well. But you have these ideas, these things kind of flower in your mind, like, oh my God, this giant cactus. And then you tell your friends, and they're sort of like, okay, and the
and then I'm
question
like,
that
I
I
shouldn't
think,
have told anyone.
but you wait until you read my novel, right? But the question that I have, and I think might, some people at home might be asking, is like, wow, I meditate and I have these sorts of thoughts sometimes, or I don't meditate and I have these sorts of thoughts. How do you know when you really have one? How do you grade and discern among the various fish? I guess like it's just persistent, or it's so big and glaring that you just know it. Because I think part of any writer's gift or creative person's gift is sort of knowing when they have a big fish on the hook and when they don't. It's something that you might get better at as you go through the years, is learning how to notice what you notice and learning how to recognize a good idea when you have one. Like, can you just talk a little bit about that part of it for you? And also maybe if there's anything to add in terms of how meditation helps that.
Sure. So I think I have to fall in love. It's like I can't not do it. When I can't not tell this, it's like I fall in love. I fall in love with an image. I fall in love with a story. It's like, and I feel like the process of writing a novel is like any long-term relationship. Like it's good if it starts hot, like it's good to have that heat in the beginning. Cause like, I don't know, 10 years in, 15 years in, it's hard to keep that fire burning. Right. So but and it may not be like hot in the sense of, you're like, I'm on fire, because I think then there's sometimes, right, like you can feel on fire about an idea and then it like peters, right? There's sort of like when it's just lust, and not love. But I think when it's just, yeah, it's like it's like a marriage, or it's like it's like a relationship, like you just sort of know. And I think also there have been times, like I wrote this novel that remains in a drawer, that like I just kind of knew I was like fooling myself with this idea, like that like I didn't give that, like I wasn't tormented by it, like I wasn't, and I wasn't like,
Well, obsessed,
I could
right?
take it or it's obsession. It's obsession. Yeah. It's like, it's just like, this is the one. Yeah. Yeah.
That's what it is. It's interesting how, like, obsession, which, like, you say you're dealing with OCD, like obsessive thinking and obsessive behavior or whatever, can be problematic, right? For all of us. If you get too fixated on something, it can end up kind of torturing you or causing trouble for you. But when it comes to like writing a novel and sticking with it over the long term, which we must if we're going to see these things through, noticing when you're really obsessed about something and having some sort of familiarity with that feeling or that operation within you can be useful. Like you can put it to work for you is the point, right?
Definitely. And that's like when I was like really hitting bottom with like my med changes, and like with the OCD, which I didn't even know I had. I mean, I like, it's, my friends are like, of course you have OCD. Like everyone's like, yeah, like you've had it your whole life. But I didn't know really until this year, or like wasn't diagnosed until this year. But like, like the therapist I was working with at the IOP were just like, you need to be writing. You need to be writing. Like there's no, and not writing, like not doing a journal project cataloging, your mental health. You need to be writing fiction, right? Because it's that, and that's, I think, like to parallel it to meditation, right? It's like we have the thoughts, but then there can be this juicy springboard, right? And there's an alchemy, and there's the dark theater, right? And it's not, we're not going to get it all the time, right? Like not every idea is good, and not every thought is a keeper. In fact, most of them are not keepers, better to not. But I think, yeah, I do believe our blessings are our curses. And it's actually, I remember years ago, I went to the New Yorker Festival, and I remember someone asked and Fiona Apple was being interviewed, and this was like a long time ago. And the interviewer said to her, like, is it worth it to be so troubled, to be such a genius, right? And she was like, how do I even answer that question? She's like I have a choice, right? And I'm not saying I'm a genius, but I am troubled. And but I do think that like any talent that I have, like there is like it is the flip side, right? Like you're saying, you can put your OCD to good use, like that the obsession. And in a way, like the act of writing a novel can be seen as a compulsion, right? It is repetitive. Editing is repetitive. To keep going back again and again to this thing is kind of insane, but it's like but it's the solution to an obsession, or it's this, and it's a positive one.
Well, I think it's also for certain people maybe more the case that their art really is part of a system that helps them make sense of their lives and synthesize a variety of different thoughts and feelings and whatnot. But it's also a survival thing. Like I do feel like there are artists, and you're one of them, that it's like how you survive. It's a central part of how you survive is to write fiction, which is I think why your therapist was like, you need to be writing.
And poetry. Yeah.
And because it's like, this word synthesis keeps coming back up. It's like, yeah, you're meditating, you're recognizing the ephemerality of your thoughts and feelings and getting familiar with the things that you're obsessed with that are really bothering you. And you're working your way through these big feelings and learning how to carry them. But then on the writing side of it, it gives you a way of synthesizing it and maybe further deepening your understanding. I know people have different feelings about the therapeutic value of writing. And I'm not suggesting that you're merely writing fiction for therapeutic purposes, but it does have, from my perspective, a therapeutic effect in the aggregate when you work through a book with like thematic concerns that have to do with deep grief, just as one example in Death Valley. When you finish that project and you send it out into the world, it's not that there's like full closure or anything like that, but it did serve some purpose in that regard, no?
Definitely. I mean, actually, it's funny because, by the way, this whole time there's been this beam of light just shining right through the center of your forehead. You just moved, so now it's on the side. And I'm like, it's so perfect for the meditation episode.
That is wild. That's my sky. I mean, there's a skylight in this room, and this time of year, the sun is at just the right place. So there's nothing I can do about these solar.
It's beautiful. It's like all that meditation is paying off.
That's right.
It's like it's like a unicorn horn of enlightenment. It's a halo. Actually, it sort of looks like you're being stabbed in the forehead.
I lied. There is not a skylight. I don't know what that is, but it just happens to be emanating from me. I guess it's something.
Keep practicing.
My inner light. It just can't contain.
It's your
my
inner
skull
light.
Cannot contain.
It's your inner light. What were we talking about? I don't even know. I got
just like the therapeutic benefit,
yeah.
And like writing Death Valley, and I know, you lost your father, and that's a big thing to grapple with. And like you're grappling with it in this book to some degree.
Yeah.
And like at the end of the process, there is some therapeutic benefit. You do reach some deeper understanding, or no?
Well, it was the whole time I was writing the book, I felt like I had this forward motion with my dad, and like this sort of the alchemy of it, right? Like what you're talking about in terms of writing being like taking pain and like I always see it as like an oyster with sand in its shell, right? And like writers write, an oyster emits this fluid, emits this fluid, emits this fluid around this sand in its shell. And I'm not saying like good writing is therapy. Like, you know, it's not a diary, but it's like I do it because I have to do it. I just have to do it. And then sometimes you get a pearl and sometimes you don't. Right. But it can be therapeutic along the way. But then when I finished the book, that's when I like kind of fell apart, like because it was like, oh, we no longer have any forward motion together. You know, like there was this sort of forward motion I had with my dad the whole time I was writing the book. I'm looking at a picture of my dad on my shelf right now. He looks like a 80s leader of a drug cartel with his fro and his mirrored sunglasses. But hi, Dad. But yeah, it was. You know, I did feel like, I mean, I don't know that my dad would have wanted to be written about, but it doesn't matter because it's fiction anyway. You know, it's like, but especially not written about in this context. You know, like what it's like to have someone, you know, in the ICU on life support, in and out of consciousness on a feeding tube for 6 months, right? Like it's not how you like want to necessarily be portrayed, but you know, but because the book's really about like anticipatory grief, but I think in a way it was like a way of keeping him alive and staying in what had been such an awful time, but also those moments are so precious at the end of someone's life when you and when you get to, I mean, I was able to spend after once we were allowed in the hospital when COVID sort of simmered down, like I was able to spend like, I kept flying back and forth to the East Coast and I was able to spend like this beautiful time with him. And, you know, and the book was really an extension of that. And then once I finished writing, and that's, I think, in some ways, I think like, I don't know. I mean, I've never canceled a book tour and I am someone with anxiety disorder, lifelong anxiety disorder. So it's interesting that this is the one where I couldn't do it. You know, I think that I'll say this, and this actually goes back to what we were saying about wanting to be done. The book Death Valley really explores like grief as a desert, right? And when you're lost in the desert and, you know, what do you do and what do you do when you're lost in the desert? What do you do when you're lost in grief? Like you have to keep moving. You have to keep walking. You have to also like go with the terrain. And it looks very barren, but there's also these beautiful oases within the desert, right? Like the desert is teeming with life. But the thing is that my character in the book, the protagonist, she does come to a sort of resolution, right? And it's not a neat ending, and I'm not gonna, but it's emotionally, right? Like all of our characters, there's an arc, and then they get to disappear on the last page. But we keep walking with these very issues that troubled us, and even if they've changed, right? Like even if the issue, you know, like with Be Brief, even if, I mean, I've literally seen the concerns change between the first draft and the draft that was published. I mean, the first draft was so different. And so I think that, but the character gets to have an arrival, even if it's not an ending that's tied up in a bow. There is sort of, because they disappear on the last page, but the writer has to keep walking, right? So like the only way out is through, yes, for our characters, but not for us. And I think there was like a feeling of, almost like emotional fraudulence in a way that made it hard for me to do events for this book, because I was like, okay, my character is sort of okay towards the end of this book, but like, I'm not okay, you know, and then that's the second arrow, right? And I would say maybe I would even go as far as to say that the third arrow maybe writing.
Yeah, well, I mean, I think it's like when it's super personal and kind of raw, you know, material that you're working from, lived experience that you're working from, doing events can be hard. I felt that for sure. I was like, ugh, the last thing I want to do is read from this book in front of people. like just read it. I want people to read it, but it's like getting up in front of people and like doing an event. I think I have issues with that in general. I'm not a writer who loves readings. That's just my personal taste on it. I don't know.
Who likes readings?
Some people love them. They love events, and like you know, to each their own. I don't want to like poo-poo somebody's good time, you know, but for me, it's like, I wrote the book, I'll put it out in the world. Like, if you want to read it, read it. It's all yours. Go have a private moment with it. I'm not going to stand in front of you and read it to you. You know?
The best is when a publisher, I like doing interviews because I like talking about the work, but the best is when a publisher's like, do you want to write like a person, like an essay, you know, to kind of tie into and I'm like, I just wrote a book.
Right.
Like, what? I gotta write an essay about about the book?
No, I said what
I
I
wrote a
want to
book.
say.
Yeah, like 10 ways that 10 ways that the desert is like grief. No, I wrote the
No.
book. It's in the book.
No listicles. We're not
Yeah,
doing listicles. It's not happening.
it's not happening.
So we've kind of talked about creative genesis and drafting and the use of meditation and how it can be helpful to that part of the process where you're kind of noticing what you notice and then you're able to synthesize things and maybe even notice that synthesis while you're meditating. But there are also creative benefits that you have derived from meditation in the editorial process. You mentioned it a little bit ago that you can use it when you're editing as well. But I want to drill down into that, and if you could give an example of how meditation has been helpful to you as you've gone about editing, that would be great. And I think there's a story you were telling me about Milk Fed where that came into play at like the Crown Plaza Hotel or something.
Where all the great books are born.
I was going to say, what city was this in? I'm curious.
New York.
Oh, it was. Okay.
New York. So when I was on book tour for the Pisces, I had written many drafts of Milk Fed, and I'd sent it to my agent. And my agent said that, and just for those who don't know, Milk Fed is the story of a reform, like a mall Jew, like a reformed Jewish woman with an eating disorder who falls madly in love with a very Zoftig Orthodox Jewish woman who works at a frozen yogurt shop in Los Angeles. And so, and the Zoftig woman is Miriam, and the reformed Jewish woman with the eating disorder is Rachel. And so I had sent it to my agent, and my agent said, I saw my agent when I was in New York, and she said, I think this is going to work. Showing the book to my agent, and we talked about it while I was in New York, and she was concerned that Rachel, the reformed Jewish woman, that like she was objectifying Miriam, this other character, and she's like, maybe we need more of Miriam's voice. Because it like wasn't clear, like, is Rachel objectifying Miriam? Isn't she? Or are we seeing Miriam? Like, it wasn't clear. Are we seeing Miriam through Rachel's eyes? Like, is that supposed to be the case? Right. Which is fine, but like, then make it clear, that like, this isn't sort of a like omniscient view of Miriam. This is Rachel's perspective. And I was like, oh, all right, I guess I'll write, maybe am I going to do like one of those alternating chapter things where there's different character voices? Like, what am I going to do? So I go back to the Crown Plaza where I'm staying, and I meditate. And while I'm meditating, this idea of the golem comes to me, which one of my favorite books, The Puttermesser Papers by Cynthia Ozick, is about. And a golem is, it started in the Jewish tradition. It's like a Frankenstein. So it's a character. It's a doll or an entity that you shape out of clay, or you shape out of dirt, and then life is breathed into it. And usually with the golem, it's like it starts out as something that then is to help your people, but then it ends up running amok, right? Like Frankenstein's monster. That was Pickle yawning. So I'm like, what am I gonna do about this problem that I have? And I was like, well, what if Rachel in therapy with her therapist shapes out of clay like this figure that she's so afraid of becoming, like what she's so afraid of happening to her body with her eating disorder. And this all came to me in meditation, like this idea of the golem. And then also in that same meditation, I was like, and what if there's a rabbi that she's imagining? Like, what if the rabbi of Prague, Rabbi Judah Ben Low Ben Bezalel, who was like the original creator of the golem, like, what if she starts having visions of him? And this way we know that Rachel is a character who's very capable of imagining things, of projecting things. And so we know that the Miriam we are seeing is clearly Rachel's projection, because this is a character who is perceived. And also now there's this question too of, is Rachel conjuring Miriam? I don't think Rachel conjured Miriam, but we have this golem that she sculpts out of clay, and then the golem goes missing, and then she suddenly meets Miriam. And it's sort of like, and this character's like, wait a second, did I conjure this person? And that lets us know as readers that lets the reader know that, like, okay, this is a character who's clearly capable. Like, we are really seeing Miriam through her eyes, right? It's not, and that's where, is she objectifying her? absolutely, she is projecting a lot. She's also she's fully imagining this rabbi of Prague, and she's now having a relationship with him. So what I did was I then wove the golem and the rabbi into the book, and they're like major. I mean, the rabbi is like a major character in the book, and the rabbi ended up being actually my favorite character in the book, probably because I spent the least time with him, because I had been with the other characters for so much longer. So that's like one way that, meditation can really, really help me with the editing process.
Well, it's interesting too. I mean, it's like I was thinking as you were talking, like this golem, this rabbi, this is the mystery of creativity. Like, where the fuck did they come from? Like, obviously they're somewhere in your wiring, but they're also somewhere like in the ether. And you sit down and you quiet down to some extent, and they appear to you. They emerge, and you notice them. And it's this solution to a problem that has, I guess, recently been presented to you by your agent, and in the absence of that meditation session, maybe it doesn't, or maybe it comes a long time after. I guess we'll never know. But
or maybe it doesn't. Maybe you're trying to figure it out. I got to puzzle this out,
But instead, it sort of just floated up, and you noticed it when it happened, and it was really, truly pivotal. Like, it really made the book. It made the book make sense, but it also added these necessary layers that I think make it succeed, to some extent at least, and that's fascinating. And I know too, you were saying something to me about a Siberian shamanic meditation. I cannot leave this conversation without hearing you talk about it, because I had to Google this. I was like, okay, I know there's a strong shamanic tradition in Siberia, and there's a meditation modality born out of that you're familiar with. Is that right?
There is. So I'm not that familiar with it. Basically what happened was, Libby, the audiobook, so like the library app, Libby.
Okay.
So I was, so I took out this book right a couple months after my dad died that was like guided shamanic meditations. Cause I was very into, I was very into signs at the time. And I was just sort of like, I had all these, thought I had all these signs from my dad. And, and this woman studied under the Siberian tradition, and I can't get canceled because I'm Russian. So it's great. It was great. So I can talk about this freely. So it was Siberian shamanism, and I am fully 100% Eastern European, Lithuanian, Polish, Russian. So I'm like, great. This is like my people, whatever. So I'm doing these guided meditations, and in one of them, you ask it a question. And my question was, how do I know that my father is still with me? And then in the meditation, you're told you journey to the upper realm. You journey to the upper realm. I still can't tell you what the upper realm is. But so there are different ways. She gives different ways that you can journey to the upper realm. You can ride up on a smokestack. You can climb up a rainbow. So I close my eyes. I'm sitting right where I am now on this. I don't have a desk in my office. I have a lounger. I write on a lounger. And I had Pickle on my lap, as he is, and he was probably being as disruptive as he is right now, growling. And I'm sitting there, and in this meditation, I'm not a very visual person. Like, I don't always have images coming to me all the time, as much as it might seem like it from this podcast. But I'm not super visual. I think in words usually. And all of a sudden, I imagine that I was riding on this bird up to this upper realm, and I've got Pickle on my lap, and I'm riding on this bird, and I just knew the bird was my dad. And it was like, of course I'm with you. I'm always with you. Not in a Bette Midler wing beneath my wings way, but just it was like, of course, it was like, how could you even think I'm not with you? You are riding on this bird. All right. So fast forward a year later, I've been writing Death Valley for a year, or over a year actually, because it was probably 15 months. And I'm at this part of the book where the character's been lost in the desert, and she's out of water, out of food. I didn't know. I had to read a book on that was like a desert survival manual, but for military to and it actually really informed the plot. But I had to read this book because I know nothing about survival. I brought Coke Zero into the desert basically, and no water. That's how much I know about survival. So she knows more than me, but not that much more, this protagonist. But so I'm like, how? So she needs to get up this mountain, and she's injured. She broke her foot, and I'm like, how am I going to get this bitch up the mountain? I'm like, oh, and the books were coming towards the end. I'm like, how am I going to get her up the mountain? And so I go through my notes, and I had written down bird, like in my page of notes for Death Valley. Like I keep this long, simple note doc with just stuff that might go in, stuff that might not go in. And it was all the way at the bottom because it had been so early. And I was like, bird. And I was like, holy shit, she's going to fly up on this bird. Now I know that sounds like, how are you going to make her, but it does work. But so then so I named the bird Mustache Oriole because my father had a mustache, and her father in the book has a mustache. The character of the father is not my father, but the mustache needed to live. Like the mustache,
Right.
the mustache must be preserved. And then what I did was I wove Mustache Oriole in like throughout the book, because you can't just like introduce a bird at the end, like, oh yeah, she's just gonna ride up on a damn bird. I mean, even if this is a person who's going into giant cacti, right? Like you can't just bring in. It's like Chekhov's bird, but in reverse, right? Like, if she's flying up on a bird, the bird needs to be there from the beginning. So then that's the work. I had a poetry teacher who once said to me, you can do anything you want in a poem, but first you have to teach the reader how to live in it, and then you can do whatever you want. And so that's what I did. And Mustache Oriole lives. And it was all because I had that meditation like 12 months before, where I'd written on this bird from an audiobook I was listening to for free on Libby about shamanic meditation. So there it was.
Well, two things that I'm taking away. One is that in two of your books, at least, you've had an editorial process that involved finding a kind of creative solution or some tweaks to make that you then wove throughout the entire text. It wasn't just like a drop in at a certain point in the book. It was something that you had to weave into the entire text in order for it to work. And then the second takeaway is that sometimes the benefits creatively that you derive from a session of meditation might not be immediately apparent, but can emerge later. Keeping a notebook or like a notes file of things that occur to you both in your day-to-day life. It doesn't have to be while you're in a seated meditation. It could be while you're at the grocery store or anywhere. You jot things down. I know writers can benefit from that, but maybe particularly when you're in this kind of contemplative state and you're trying to kind of settle and go deeper, the stuff that emerges there might often, or like you might have a higher batting average of useful stuff, but it's worth writing down because this stuff is slippery. At least if you're me, I can forget things so easily. So I think those are the two things that I heard you say that I'm taking away. Is there anything you would add or subtract from that?
No, I mean, keep a diary, baby. Keep a notebook.
It's
Mine's
useful.
on my phone, but yes.
So I know you got to run, but I think the last couple things I want to talk about are just kind of like a reiteration or a review of things that we've sort of already touched on for people who are listening, in particular, who might be newer to meditation or might be spotty, and they're like, I kind of want to maybe do it and integrate it with their writing, but maybe have trouble keeping the discipline. Like something I have noticed, and I think it's probably true for everybody, is that there is often resistance. Not always, but especially, I don't know, it depends on the day, depends on how long you've been practicing, how maybe used to it you are. But there can often be resistance to stopping, because that is what meditation, I think, the first part of it anyway, is just getting yourself to the cushion. You've got to stop. You've got to put the phone down. You've got to put everything down. And you've got to sit there and probably close your eyes, though I know some people keep their eyes open. But you just sit still. You stop. And even for me, years I've been doing this, decades. And sometimes I'll be like, especially in the evening, I don't want to, there's like this resistance to stopping. Do you feel that?
Yeah. I mean, well, this morning I was like, let's buy candles instead.
Diptyque. That's what I was going to tell you. Those are great candles.
Diptyque are lovely. It's a lovely. What's your favorite Diptyque?
Oh God, if you said it, I would know. I haven't gotten one.
Berries, the berries one?
Maybe so. I don't know. They're
Maybe
just
Feu de Bois, the fire.
The thing I like about them is that the smell really is like, it carries. Like you can cover a whole section of your house with one little candle.
I love what a basic bitch you are, Brad. I mean, now I know what to get you for the rest of your life. I'm like, Brad loves Diptyque candles. That's so endearing. They are the best.
They are. I like, because some of them, they go fast. They don't smell that great. Or if they do smell, it's like, it doesn't really, you have to like be like,
and they're beautiful.
Standing over it in order to like derive the benefits. But yeah, so stopping is hard, and it's hard for everyone, and you're not doing it wrong if there's resistance. But what I would add to that is that, and I would then ask you to sort of like join in and share whatever thoughts you have on it, is that even on those days where I'm like struggling to stop and to just get to the cushion and sit down, usually by the end of the session, it's not an issue at all. Like that goes away. So for somebody who's newer to it, I think that's important to underline, is that like that's normal, but like just sit down. And if you stick it out through like the 20 or 30 minutes or whatever it is that you sit for, uh, it's
Or
going to,
5 if you're new.
or 5 if you're new. Cause like,
5 if you're nasty.
yeah, right. But that's a good point too, is that like sometimes by giving yourself more achievable goals, it's easier to build a habit than it is to like give yourself this, like, I'm going to sit for an hour and you're
Yeah.
miserable, you know?
But
But yeah,
I do think you're right though. Like 20 minutes seems to be a really good sweet spot, in the sense of like I can be like resisting for 15, and then like usually the last 5 is when I like transcend a bit more.
yeah.
The
So there's
theater
just
goes darker.
the theater. I find, yeah, I'm a person who needs, I think maybe because I have a noisier brain or something, but like I'm like, if I can sit for an hour, that's the
Oh,
best.
oh,
Cause like
delish.
it's delish. Cause like what happens is that like I go through, I know there's going to be like the first half of it at least, sometimes the whole thing even. Like for an hour, I'll just be sitting there watching this circus unfold, you know, or whatever. But sometimes I just talk it's like you talk yourself out, you know. My brain is just jabbering at me, and I keep like, I'll go to my breath, and then the brain will take over, and all of a sudden I will be lost inside some crazy mental theater for like what, 5, 7, 10 minutes before I even realize that I've been lost.
Totally.
And then you go back to your breath, and you have to have a little bit of gentleness and good humor towards yourself, no matter how many times it takes. And it will take, even in a single session, dozens of times where you kind of fall off the horse, right? And then you get
Oh
back on, you
yeah.
go back to your, like, that's normal. And I think people need to hear that, because like people go, oh my God, I'm just crazy, I can't do this. But that's it. No matter how many times you fall, gently just go back to your breathing. Don't castigate yourself. If you castigate yourself, notice that, then
Yeah.
gently
Don't
go back.
castigate yourself for castigating.
Right. So there's
The
that.
80th arrow.
Yes. And then the other thing is that, and I think this is a good place to close, is that in my understanding of meditation is that it's not necessarily like, it is a thing you do, and it is like a ritual practice that you can derive benefits from if you say do seated meditation every single day and you try to be disciplined about it. I think there's great benefit to be derived. I think science is sort of corroborating this as we speak. You know, I think that's why it's become mainstreamed in a lot of ways. It's not something you believe in, it's something you do. It's not something that has to be tied to a particular religious practice or any
Mm-hmm.
of that. It's totally non-denominational and what's the word for it? Secular, right?
Mm-hmm.
But I think the deeper you go into it and the more you build it into your life, the more you start to try to carry it with you, even when you're not sitting.
Mm.
And my understanding of it is that like you shouldn't really consider like meditation to be an isolated session. There's meditating while sitting. There's meditating while walking. There is such a thing as walking meditation that people do. There's meditation while lying down. So if you're in bed and you're, you know, in between wake and sleep, you could be meditating. Like the ideal is that you're really kind of like always meditating and always aware. And that's like maybe the
Who
place that,
among us?
yeah, who among us, but that's like maybe the ideal that you're sort of striving toward. But
Mm-hmm.
the reason why I mention it is that you have benefited from this very thing, even though you know, you might not have even been trying, like thinking of it in those terms. But it's like the meditation on the beach in Venice, where you're out and about and, you know, you're kind of like, oh, the water, oh, this, and you're synthesizing these things. That sort of stuff doesn't happen unless you have a kind of situational awareness after the session where you recognize what you recognized, or the bird, or, you know, whatever it is, the bits that we pick up as creative writers that we then jumble together and put into our fictions. That stuff happens in moments of awareness off the cushion usually, and
Mm-hmm.
not in what we would consider to be an isolated meditation session.
Mm.
Do you see what I'm saying? Like,
Yes.
so it's like, it's the kind of thing that I think seated meditation as a ritualized practice helps to strengthen those muscles, but you can do it, you can and should do it anywhere. And like just being aware of your thoughts and aware of what's going on, like within you and around you, that is mindfulness, right? Uh, and it can be useful to a creative person to have maybe like a heightened level of that, right?
I mean, I think so.
Yeah.
Totally. No, I think you're right. In you and around you. Like the Beatles.
That's yeah.
Life flows on within Brad and around Brad.
Why am I quoting songs? I feel like
No, I love it. I love it.
there was a Motown moment earlier. We're in
There
the
was.
60s. We're in the 60s, which is where
We
we probably
are.
should be.
Hot fruit, baby.
Yeah, hot fruit. That's it.
But Brad, I just wanted to say, as we wrap, that doing this podcast actually, and knowing we were going to talk about meditation, inspired me. I actually impulsively posted on Instagram yesterday. I'm gonna do lead like a once a week different. It'll be different day every week or a different time every week, but meditation for writers. Just like a guided meditation, and maybe with like a writing prompt. I actually don't know exactly what I'm gonna do, but and it'll be free. Donations will be welcome, but it's free. Anyone can come, and you just email me eatingaloneinmycar@gmail.com, because I was thinking, because I taught a class last year and talked about this, and people the kids seem to be really interested in. I just think that there are a lot of writers who meditate, so it could be cool for us to do it all together on Zoom. It's going to be on Zoom.
On Zoom. Okay.
Yes.
So you heard it here first. Did we just break news? I guess you broke it.
We just
on
broke
Instagram.
news.
Yeah.
I broke yesterday.
Okay. Well,
Eating alone in my car. And
That's
now I'm
great.
like, am I going to regret this? But I don't think I will, because I can always just stop doing it. But for now, it's going to happen.
That's cool. That's cool. And I mean, ultimately what we're talking about is just trying to be more creative and get better creative work done as writers. And that's really what it's all about. So I love talking with you. It's great to see you. It's great to see Pickle.
So good to see you.
Your lovely dog, who is like, I believe, staring at you right now. Is he just looking?
I saw Twiggy in the background.
Yeah. Hi, Pickle.
Yes,
hi, buddy.
My angel. You've got Brad's dog, who is the ultimate in trained, and you've got my dog, who is the ultimate in completely untrained and untrainable.
All right. Well, on that note, it's great to see you. Great to talk to you. Thank you for the time.
Thanks, Brad. It's so good to see you, and thanks for having me.